Welcome to the Seen and Heard podcast, and I'm Dr. Cathy Wield. In this series, I'm departing a little from my usual in welcoming a very special guest today, Harriet Ware-Austin, who spent much of her adult life working in the field of human rights. Before I talk to Harriet, I'm just going to fill you in on the reason why I personally came to meet this remarkable person. As you probably know, I'm an ex-boarder, and while I was writing about my own recovery journey for my memoir Unshackled Mind, I was reflecting on what happened in the summer term when I was just 12 years old. I was staying at my grandmother's on the last day of the Easter holidays, and suddenly on the news I saw the face of one of my school friends, because she had survived a terrible plane crash which happened as it took off from Addis Ababa. Back at school, obviously, we were all talking about it, and then at some point our class was called into the school hall, and my friend's uncle told us very briefly about the crash. My friend was now in hospital in the UK with severe burns, but we were told that one of her friends, in fact, two, had died in the crash. And I discovered on listening to the radio that in fact Caroline and Jane were Harriet's two sisters who tragically lost their lives in the plane crash. As a class, we were given a stern warning not to talk about the crash and were instructed not to upset our friend by asking her questions when she eventually returned to school. Of course, we were 12-year-olds and it was very shocking and awful, but we were at boarding school and there was nothing further we could do. No one to talk to, so we just got on with it. And when Debbie did return 2 weeks before the end of term, I honoured the request. I thought she was amazing, so calm, and I was going home on the plane myself. I was scared, but I didn't want to upset her by asking how she was. So here I am, years later, actually Googling the crash, wondering what actually happened, and then a few days later, on the 21st of April 2021, on my way to work, listening to Radio 4's Life Changing, I hear this voice speaking of the very same event. It was Harriet. And even though, this is where I'm going to cry, I was supposed to start my shift, I listened to the end in the hospital car park in floods of tears, for which I apologise now because it always brings me to tears. And I knew I must meet this remarkable woman who chose to speak out about something that's been locked away for so many friends and families of both survivors and those who so tragically lost their lives, many of whom were children returning to boarding school. So, Harriet, do you want to tell us the story from your point of view, which is far, far more poignant than anything that, I myself experienced?
Sure, very happy to. And thanks so much for having me on this. I'm very honoured to be invited. Yeah, so my family went out to Ethiopia. Previously, we had been living in Kenya, where I was born, and my sisters were born in Uganda. We went out in 1969 to join my father, who'd been sent there by the British government, loaned, I think, to the Ethiopian government. And initially, we were living out in the wilds on a stational farm outside Addis, quite a long way outside Addis. And it was really idyllic life. We had 2 horses and just thousands of acres to roam. And so I rode every single day. My mother taught me, home taught me on a special scheme that they had, probably still do have, for parents who are in very remote places to educate their children. I think I had 2 hours teaching a day, and even that felt much too long. Although it was actually quite fun, certainly better than school once I went to a real school. And then off I'd go. And so life carried on like that. It was glorious. We then moved into Addis a little while later. And initially my middle sister was with us for 6 months. And then Jane had already started boarding school from Kenya, and Mum always says that the second worst thing in her life was having to take and leave Jane at boarding school. And then, yes, after 6 months, Caro joined her, which was also pretty awful. And they never really, well, I don't know. They didn't complain too much. They didn't complain at all. I think they wanted to protect us. And so, in fact, Jane dwelt on all the fun things that happened at school. And my parents did say to them, you know, if it's unbearable, we'll take you away. So I think that was a bit of a lifeline. Anyway, so roll on a couple of years, and it was always, I mean, it was so wonderful when they came home, and we did lots and lots of things, travelled around Ethiopia, doing lots of lovely, happy family things together. And then, but after about 2 days of their being home, the sinking feeling would begin as we dreaded the inevitable parting again. And so it was on one such of those partings, April the 18th, 1972, when we took them to the airport and said goodbye and watched them walk out onto the plane. In those days, there was an open place where you could stand and watch the aeroplanes come and go. And so we waved them off. They turned and smiled and waved and walked into the plane. And a few minutes later, it set off. And it went up to the top of the runway. It's a very difficult runway, I believe, because it's surrounded by hills, mountains, and it's too short, all of which was significant. And so it set off in the usual way. Everything looked fine. And then when it got to right down at the end of the runway, we suddenly saw this huge column of black smoke coming up. And my father said, "Oh my God, it's on fire." And he and a friend, in fact, Debbie's father, they just went and they drove down to the end of the runway and ran to try and see what they could find. And Richard very wonderfully, thankfully, found Debbie alive and with burns on her arms, but otherwise not badly hurt. Though I'm sure that was painful enough. And my father ran round and round the plane screaming. And eventually he found Caro, who had, she and Debbie had got off together. They had been sitting next to each other. And they jumped off the plane. And, you know, it's a long drop, if you think of it without stairs. And they were holding hands, but they got separated in midair. And Debbie ran up the hill, which saved her life. And Caro ran down the hill, which meant she was running through the fuel that was spilling out of the plane. And so she was very badly burnt. All her clothes were burnt off when Dad found her. And she had then got stuck in barbed wire that was at the end of all around the runway. So she was in the most terrible, terrible situation. And yes, all her clothes had been burnt off, but her shoes had been burnt onto her feet. Anyway, some people took her to the Seventh-day Adventist hospital, which was taking all the survivors and injured. And somehow Mum and I, who just stood frozen watching from afar, the flames and the smoke, somehow we got to the hospital, and neither of us to this day can remember how we got there. But anyway, she went in and she found Caro, who was difficult to recognise because they all had, their faces were all covered in black soot, and her hair was all frizzed up from the fire. But she was conscious, and she recognised my mother, of course. And I was standing outside with Debbie, funnily enough. I mean, she must have been in so much pain, but she didn't say anything at all. And lots of journalists were running around. It was chaos. Patients being brought in, survivors being brought in. So, yes, there was an extraordinary man called Mr. Panton who apparently stopped. Instead of jumping off the plane, he stood at the door and he was encouraging and ushering everyone out, trying to give a little bit of support and help, and he spent so long there that by the time they brought him in, they brought him in and put him right down in front of me. I was sitting outside the ward where Caroline was, and he his face had just been burnt away. All you could see were his two eyes staring out. And he died a few hours later. But we've always thought of him, what a hero he was. And then we went back to the house. They found someone to put me up for the night, because my parents were going to spend the night at Caro's bedside. And I went and stayed with a doctor, the embassy doctor, that's right. And they were very kind. I mean, I should imagine it was terribly difficult for them to know what to do with the little girl. I was 8. And anyway, so I didn't see my parents for a couple of days. Well, no, I'd seen her mum that evening because she said, she came into my room and said, "I'm afraid Jane must be dead. We just have to remember her lovely smile and always keep her close." Anyway, so I then went off, and while I was staying with this doctor, the next morning I heard an Ethiopian funeral outside in the road, and they're very loud affairs, lots of drums and horns. And for some reason, I became convinced that it was Jane's funeral and that they hadn't waited for me, they hadn't included me, which is a horrible thought, but of course it wasn't. Anyway, then I went on to another family who had 4 children, and I remember going riding with them. With the one. She phoned me actually after the programme. And then after about 3 days, they sent a plane out to get the injured back to the UK or wherever. A lot of Italians were there too. So we flew via Cyprus, and one of the stewards on that flight, by the end of it, he'd been working 48 hours constantly. He was absolutely shattered. Anyway, he wrote a memoir, and he talked about these child victims, and he talked about the terrible, terrible smell of burnt flesh, which is what I remember very well as well, and how he never knew what happened. He never knew what happened to these children and young people until he heard my programme. Although I think I got in touch with him before then. And similarly, the man who nursed Caroline, he'd put her on the plane, seen her onto the plane, and then he heard no more for 49 years until he heard the programme. I mean, it's quite a remarkable thought. All those people left just speculating. And anyway, we arrived at Brize Norton, where she was helicoptered off to a hospital nearby, which had a special burns unit, I think. And at about 2 o'clock in the morning, there was a loud knocking on our door, and a nurse called for my parents. "You better come quickly, your little girl's very, very ill." So they ran off, and then a little while later they walked slowly back and sat on their bed talking. Now, this is interesting because I've blanked something out here. My grandparents were there, and I just cannot remember it. I can remember so many things, but that is a complete blank. I do not remember them being there. But anyway, they sat on my parents' bed, and I pretended I was asleep because I didn't want them to tell me what I knew they were going to tell me. And my sisters always made recordings, messages to say thank you at the end of the holidays. And they had made one on the morning of the 18th, and my father had brought that recording with him and the tape recorder, and they played it. They played it there and then, and it was just quite an extraordinary thing. And then we, as my mother said, within 4 days our lives had been changed so much, suddenly they had to work out where to bury their daughters. Just extraordinary. And we had no connections with England. We'd all been born and bred in Africa. And so, they didn't know what to do. But then someone said, well, what about burying them at their school? And so that's what we did. And luckily they did. Now, of course, that they wouldn't have done anything else, but they didn't let me go to the funeral, although I was taken away before the burial. And the smell of spring flowers always makes my mother and me think of that funeral. And yeah, then we went back to Ethiopia for, I think it was about 3 months to pack up. Although Dad's office had said we definitely needed to go back. They would have it all done for us. But we wanted to sort out, make sure the staff were okay, organise for our dog to be flown to England, make sure the horses got good homes and the guinea pigs and all the important things. So we went back, but we no longer travelled anywhere. Dad had to, because he was making a film actually on soil erosion, which was very successful. And then we returned to England. We came to live in England, which was, I have to say, horrible. It was so different from the life that we'd all had up till then. They bought me a pony, which was, and lots of animals. They let me have as many animals as I wanted. Apart from rats, they put a foot down when I started encouraging rats to come into our garden. Yes, it was really difficult. Wiltshire in the early 1970s, attitudes to death were quite extraordinary. It was a sort of a case of please don't upset us with your troubles, and for heaven's sake, don't show any emotions. Although actually, people used to, when they got me alone, they would ask me things like, "Do your parents still talk about your sisters? Do they still cry about it? Are you over it yet?" All those extraordinarily crass, emotionally unintelligent things. So it was 10 long years really of us sort of being in a bit of a tunnel until we began to emerge. We created a new life, and then we went back to live in Ethiopia, no, in Malawi. Sorry, which was wonderful in a way, except that it meant we had to put our old beloved dog down. He had come with us from Ethiopia, and I mean, he'd had a good long life, and he was getting, old dog problems at the beginning. But it was terrible, and it led to my mother pretty well having a nervous breakdown. She just couldn't function from then on until I got her out to Malawi. And it was like a final straw, I think, and almost, yes, you can more safely let go about animals. And throughout those years, we always talked a lot about my sisters, and they were very much with us in thought. And I had a stupid dream for years. I used to imagine that because we had never seen her, that Jane had actually got off and was trying to work her way home. And I used to get so carried away with this daydream. And then, of course, the reality would set in and I'd be very upset. And it's funny, of talking about people not showing emotion. Apparently my mother once said, I'd forgotten this, but she once said to me, you don't cry very much. And I said, once I begin, I'll never stop. And I think that's probably how it was. Yeah. Anyway, so we carried on. And I always have felt that boarding school was a large part of what led to what led to their deaths, and felt an intense anger with the whole institution.
Yeah, very understandable. And I know, my mother was also listening to your to Changing Lives and heard you, and she said to me afterwards, that could have been you. And of course it couldn't, because we weren't in Ethiopia. I mean, Debbie's parents were diplomats, or her father was, like my father was, and children often, for all sorts of reasons, were put on planes to be sent back to the UK for their education. But I know what she means, that children were put on planes to go back to boarding school, and this terrible tragedy happened when there were a group of children on their way back to school.
Absolutely. I mean, there were 107 people on the plane and only 43 were killed.
Sorry, how many?
43 were killed.
Right.
So a majority, thank goodness, survived. And after the life-changing program, hundreds of people literally got in touch with me. Nearly everybody had a link, but not everybody. There were all sorts of different stories, and people would begin telling their own stories, which were fascinating, including their story about the crash. So it was really very, very interesting and moving, and fascinating hearing how every individual in each family reacted their own way. Some were very much of the, well, just get on with life now. But I noticed from the relatives of the survivors of a really interesting pattern of how many went into careers that were serving others, teachers, health workers, all sorts of things like that. And a lot of them talked about this imperative to live life to its full each day and each moment. And that I can totally understand that. I mean, I think that was very much behind my finding myself in a career with human rights. It just fitted completely. And in a way, it was also, I felt it gave me quite a lot of understanding of the people who I have so often interviewed and worked with, who've had just terrible things. And with the stark contrast being that those victims, survivors, they're surviving, or didn't survive, acts by other people, from other people. Ours was an accident. It was a pure, straightforward, terrible, absolutely nearly didn't happen, as all accidents are. But these people suffered deliberate acts of others, which just is always so astonishing to think about, people doing that to other people. And so yes, I reflected on that for many, many years. And lots of people who got in touch were friends of my sisters from their boarding school, which was just wonderful. Because, I mean, apart from anything, we had always felt so sad that they were buried a long way from where we lived. And it meant our little expeditions, which were, we went every year to their graves, so 2 or 3 times a year. And then my mother began to worry so much that they were so far away. Apparently, she even asked Dad to look into exhuming them and bringing them nearer us. And I used to worry that, they'll be alone, nobody will go and see them. But all these wonderful friends of theirs assured me that they went regularly, and still do, even though they've long, long since left the school, but they go back, because I hardly ever get to the graves now. And but it was just so reassuring to hear that. It was an incredible weight off my mind. And but they, I think, rather like you at your school, well, initially they were told Jane's been killed, Caro's fighting for her life, so let's all pray for her and all of that kind of stuff. But they were given no details, and then they were told Caro's died as well now, and that was it. No more information. Yeah. No more information, and just get. The best thing you can do is bury yourself in your work and just get on with it.
Yes. Yeah.
And apparently they used to have conversations, because yes, lots of them also flew to and fro. But in the dormitories at night, they'd have conversations about, well, what do you think happened? What on earth could have caused that? And and what happens if it happens to us? And how do we prepare? What should you wear? What shoes should you have? And those sort of conversations. So they, like you, I think, suddenly, got all the answers after all these years. And
I mean, it was one of those things which just stuck in my mind, the curiosity, because of course you want to know more about the why. I'm sure the families did. I mean, goodness me, such a tragedy.
Yes.
But I think what's so, I mean, it was a sign of the times, wasn't it? That we don't talk about these things.
Mm-hmm.
We don't talk about tragedy. But the other thing which I find fascinating is how some people seem to cope with it really well and come through, and other people just don't.
Yeah.
It's and I've heard all sorts of reports in the literature that children can survive unspeakable disasters and tragedies if they know they're really loved by their families.
Yes.
And I mean, how did you do? How did you fare?
Well, I think my parents were just really, really good and instinctively did all the right things. I mean, initially by always including me, for example, of course I was at the funeral, and by talking so often about them and remembering, funny memories, happy memories, and also talking about the plane crash a lot. I think Dad found it harder, but my mother and I, we chatted away about it, and that did help. I mean, of course, I had strong feelings early on that the worst one had survived, and my sisters were such better people than I was in every way. So I did battle a lot with thinking, oh gosh, why did the wrong one have to survive? And then I also used to think, why will I now have to wait? How long will I have to wait before I see them again? Assuming that I see them again. I'm never too sure about that, but it's a nice idea. And but yeah, it was really very, very difficult, and some people were just extraordinarily insensitive. The mother of a friend of mine, one-time friend, a couple of years afterwards, a few years later, I think her son had gone on a gap year to Australia, that's right, leaving her 2 daughters at home. And Mum was asking her about it, and she said, oh yes, well, child X is particularly missing him, and Christmas is going to be so difficult without him. And so Mum said, oh yes, yeah, no, Christmas is a very testing one. And she just looked at her and said, well, surely you've got over it now.
Oh, my word.
Oh, yes, there were some really classic comments of that sort. But despite that, I think, yeah, they handled it right, and somehow we got through. I mean, you have no choice. But for me, it was the animals that helped tremendously. And for a few years, we had 3 grandparents around. And then both grandfathers died quite soon after it. My mother's father had been a fantastic support to her, and I think probably the whole strain on him accelerated his death. And that was another terrible blow for my mother. But yeah, just on we went. And then Benji, the dog, having to put him down, as I said, that was absolutely awful, and it was terrible. I had tried to arrange, actually, that the vet would come and put him down. I went in to see her and said, if I ring you when my mother's going to be out for a while, would you come and put him to sleep so that she can think that he died naturally on the lawn under the cherry tree? And of course she said, I'm afraid I can't do that. I just can't do that. But anyway, so that was terrible. And then we had a fairly happy time in Malawi, although there were more deaths, always deaths, of some of the cook's children who we had got very fond of. One died of measles, just like that, when people get funny about vaccines. I think because we went and saw her in the hospital, and it's a very, very horrible death. And another one of diarrhea, just such a common killer.
Yeah.
They were just gone so quickly. It just shows how fragile their lives are. And in a way, somehow, having lost my sisters, as I said, in relation to my work, but it sort of created this bond that we did have a little tiny taste of their fragile lives. Yes, and We did have a report on what caused the plane crash, and it was a little hook called a jacking pad, I learnt after the programme, which had fallen off a small light aircraft earlier in the day. And I mean, just the chances that the front wing of the aeroplane caught this little, just went right over it. And the rubber from the burst tyre went back into the engines. And so they didn't have enough energy to take off. But it was also, the runway was too short to stop. And so the plane careered off round into the grass, and then fell off a cliff at the end of the runway. There was a 30 metre, can't remember, drop, and it fell off that and burst open. And that was when a lot of people did get out, and a lot of people didn't. And some of the people who heard the programme, I think 3 survivors, no, more got in touch, but 3 who I regularly kept up with, they told me, which is what I wanted to know. I was always really driven to know as much as I could. I wanted to know what their experience had been, because I felt I needed to. On the 20th anniversary of 9/11, the mother of one of the victims, the Twin Towers, she said that she also just wanted to find out everything she possibly could. She'd listened to the voice recordings, and she said her daughter had to suffer it, so she felt she needed to understand it. And that was exactly my feeling, although I think, again, people react differently. A lot of people would just rather know nothing at all about it. And one such person, she got in touch. Her mother and her sister had both been killed on the plane. And her father had been so devastated that he wouldn't even have a funeral for them. And he just asked them to be taken care of, and just drew a line, never wanted to talk about it again. And amazingly, when many years later, when I started going back to Ethiopia on work, and seeing all the places we used to go, I had heard that the navigator, whose daughter has also become a friend of mine, she survived the crash, but her father was killed. I'd heard they were buried. He was buried at the War Memorial, War Graves, in the War Graves cemetery. And so I went and I found him, and I found the mother and the daughter, the engineer, and Mr. Panton, the man I was telling you about earlier, the brave man. And I didn't know he was buried there. And his children had got in touch with me. They were quite a lot older. Yeah. And I told them that I'd found his grave. And I said I had no idea he was there. It was amazing. And I told them I put flowers on it. And they said they didn't know he was there either. I mean, it's quite remarkable, these stories. So all very, very different reactions. And I suppose there's no right or wrong way, but I've just always felt it's really important to address these things. I think it helps to talk about them.
Well, the response to the programme was massive, wasn't it? And
yes,
to me, that illustrates how important it is to talk about these things which have happened, which don't leave us.
No.
And I think, okay, my viewpoint as somebody who just literally knew about my friend who'd been in it, was just one of so many.
Yeah.
So, the ripples of these things are huge.
Absolutely.
And, the fact that people made such an effort to get in touch with you and to thank you for bringing it out, because it allowed them to talk about things which had been buried deep for a very long time. And I think the same is true for many listeners here who have survived years at boarding school. And within families, it's not talked about. No. We just don't talk about it. We don't talk about what went on, what happened. and then somebody speaks out, and suddenly it unlocks keys. And I suspect that for a lot of people it was very healing.
Well, it's interesting you say that. And yes, I mean, people did seem, they were very lovely. Gosh, I had been warned by the BBC that sometimes you get trolls who will be unpleasant of anything, but actually I didn't get a single unpleasant message. I just got nothing but a great outpouring of kindness, of understanding, and as you say, people then began telling their own stories, people who'd never spoken. And there was one remarkable one, a woman she was 6 when her father was killed on the plane, and only she and her mother were left. And her aunt got in touch with me, and she said, I know she hasn't been able to listen yet, but I hope she will. I think it's important she does. Anyway, some months later, I got an email from this woman herself saying that she had finally been able to listen. And she said, in the last 2 weeks, I have talked, wept, and thought about my father more than in all these 49 years. And actually, really helpful. We then spoke, because that was usually the sequence, would have email exchanges and then very often would speak after that, and sometimes meet in person. And she said, well, she was slightly worried about speaking. I mean, she initiated it. I never pushed anyone. And at the end of it, we actually had a really lovely chat, and we laughed a lot. And, it was just very comfortable. And at the end of it, she said, I was really dreading that. I was so nervous. I thought we might cry the whole time. And I said, well, that would have been fine. That would have been okay too.
Yeah.
She said, it feels so much better. And then there was another extraordinary story of a husband and wife who were on the plane. And it was the first time they ever flew. It was the first time they ever left Mauritius, where they lived with their 4 children. And they were going to meet their son, who was doing a degree in London. And anyway, they were killed. His account was just devastating, absolutely devastating. But it was his grandchildren who got in touch with me. First their grandchildren. And they said, we've been trying to find out over the years. We never met our grandparents. We never knew them. But we've been trying. It has been so important. It has been such a central part of our life. It's the whole thing of legacy grief. And they sounded a fabulous family. And finally, their father, Patrick, got in touch with me. And as I said, he wrote a very powerful thing. Very beautiful, desperately moving. And so, yes, so the ripples, as you say, just seem to go on and on. And even the producer at the BBC, the producer at that time, he said his father had heard it and said, gosh, my friend so-and-so was her father was the vicar at the time in Addis.
Oh, wow.
Just on and on and on. Never stops. It just does show partly how connected we all are, but also, how far-reaching these things are, how many lives they touch.
Yeah. And I'm interested because obviously you've worked in the field of human rights, and we've talked about our culture of silence. Do you think we're any better?
I think we're quite a lot better than the 70s. Yes, definitely people are better. I mean, there's still a bit of a taboo, but much, much, much less so. So for example, my husband's brother, my very beloved brother-in-law, was killed 4 years ago. And just watching the reaction of people, how different, how, everyone just came around Philip, my husband, and just completely, literally put their arms around him and just gave so much support. And it was very, very, very different. And I mean, all my life I've mentioned it. I've never made a secret of the fact that I had 2 sisters who were killed. And I think, and by the time I got to university, again, I think I was just very lucky with my wonderful, wonderful friends. But they were so open to talking about it and listening and saying the right thing. And so luckily it's changing a bit, but I don't know if that goes right across society. Yes, I mean, I've always been obsessed with it. I think I wrote one of my course papers on Western attitudes to death over the I don't know, since the Victorian times or something. And yes, I've always been fascinated by the subject and by people's reactions. I find it very, very interesting. And my mother and I often talk about it's very difficult to know what to say to someone who's just lost somebody. I think the worst thing, in my opinion, is when they say, sorry for your loss, because it sounds so trite and unmeaning. I hate that expression with a vengeance. But I mean, one of the most effective things is, I don't know what to say. I'm just sorry. And that's it. And also to give people the option to talk if they want to. You know, you just open the door, and then if they want to, they can talk. But they might just make it clear that they don't want to, and that's fine. But just give them the chance, give them the opportunity if they want to. I think it's so important. I remember when a friend's mother was dying when we were all at university, and she said, why don't we get any education on death when we're at school? We get sex education, we get all this education, but no one tells us about the thing that is going to be completely inevitable in our lives, that we will lose people. And ever since then, I've thought, yep, she was absolutely right. There should be a slot on the national curriculum in the, I don't know, citizenship training. They could bring it in, and just giving a little bit of advice. I mean, funnily enough, I think the children's reactions back in the 70s were, on the whole, better. Not all of them, but quite a lot of them were because they just ask. My mother talked about a little boy in our village. Children all used to come and play in our garden because we had a nice big garden and I had a pony. So our house was always full of the village children, which was lovely. And this little boy, in fact, it was he who told me himself after he heard the programme. He said he remembered going into the kitchen for a glass of water and Mum was there and he just asked her about it. And he said, I hope that wasn't the wrong thing. And I was talking to her about it later. She said, oh no, it was just beautiful. You know, it was so natural. It's what children do. They're curious. And it was just really good. It was really nice. I didn't mind at all. In fact, I was very pleased. And but there was so much fear. Oh gosh, don't you dare show any emotion.
Oh yeah. And I mean, I can't get over the fact that, we were told not to talk about it. And that, so somewhere that the curiosity and at the time you feel a bit guilty about it, like, I shouldn't want to know. It wasn't me who was in this, I'm not the one who suffered loss. None of my relatives died, so why should I want to know? And yet, through my adult life, I carried that and I really wanted to know. I Googled it. I was thinking, what's happened? And as I say, I had great admiration for my friend Debbie. I just could not get over the fact that she was then having to do these, travels back and forwards every holiday, or most holidays, as I did on a plane. And obviously after a while you settle into the fact that this is just what we do. So no choice. I mean, people have car accidents and then they carry on traveling by car. But I think the not knowing is actually something which keeps it alive.
Yes, absolutely. And of course it's natural. I mean, gosh, when a friend is involved, it's very, very close to you. And the not knowing just creates that mystery. And as you say, it brings out all sorts of feelings, yes, like guilt, that you want to know. Why should I want to know? I shouldn't want this. And but it's human and it's essential. I mean, we always want to know. I think it's very, very strange. But that's how it was. And lots of people wrote from who weren't related, but who had gone to boarding schools themselves, and said how, of course, that, just hearing about it, not even knowing anyone on it, but or involved, but that was enough to just really trigger them and bring on these thoughts and fears and things. It's just very natural, and why they were so bad at helping children, friends, and young people just try to form some way to think about it, to deal with it, to try and approach it rather than just silence it all down. Seems so obviously stupid, in my opinion.
And I'm glad that you didn't get sent away and have that legacy.
I was all lined up to go. I mean, of course, we were living in England, but we just had this assumption that I would naturally go to their school because I was following in their footsteps. And I even took the exam for it. And then all of a sudden, we realised, well, this is going to mean I go away and I'll be boarding, and no way can that happen. Absolutely. And so we took a rapid left turn and avoided it, because I don't think it would have been the right thing for me at all. I mean, I had a fairly unhappy time at senior school until my last 2 years. Pretty, lots of nasty little girls, until I found the nice ones. But at least I went home every night, and I could just get away for 12 hours to the sanity of home and parents and animals. And it's interesting because, of course, the boarders were very aloof on the whole. I mean, some of us were more friendly with them, but with a few exceptions, they were quite sort of distant, and they called us the day bugs and that sort of thing. And when we had a reunion many decades later, we were talking about this, some of us were talking about it, and they said, oh, we were just so envious because you went home and our parents had rejected us, but you could go home every day. It was envy that made us like that to you, which I had worked that out. I was sure that was what was behind it. That's just so sad, and certainly that feeling of rejection that they spoke of, and also the way they used to speak of their parents in very sort of disparaging, unpleasant way. And I think they just had such deep hurt. Really, they felt rejected. I mean, to be sent to boarding school when the schools are round about, I can never get my head around it. And when Philip and I married, he had been sent away to boarding school from Singapore at the age of 7, in that fine old British tradition. And he had a very much better secondary school experience than I did, but we both said absolutely no way will any children of ours ever go to boarding school. Full stop. Just categorical. And we both felt very strongly about it. So, although my poor middle son didn't have to go to boarding school to be badly bullied, it can happen anywhere.
Yes, this is true.
But at least if they're at home, we can help.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for your time today. I mean, and thank you for sharing so much. And, as you know, it means a heck of a lot to me. And I think our listeners will really appreciate hearing what you've had to say.
Thank you.
And I think it is important to talk about tragedy and death and what it means for families. And,
Absolutely.
there are far too many unspoken things.
Yes.
And it has a toll on us.
Totally. Absolutely. Yes. Sorry. A quick addition. After the after I'd done that programme, the BBC were overwhelmed by how they said they'd never had a response like that, because all the emails had to go into them and then on to me. And then a couple of years later, they asked if I'd be willing to do a follow-up at the Hay on Wye Festival in front of an audience, to just talk about the reactions and what had happened since, which I did. And I was rather shocked to see how many people. I thought, oh, nobody's going to turn up to this. Rather like my mother when I told her I was doing this thing on Radio 4. She said, well, do you think anyone will listen? They said, only 4 million people. And yes, so there was a huge audience. And but what was really lovely at the end was people began to talk. You know, somebody whose daughter had had a stillbirth, somebody who'd lost a baby sister. You know, look, stories like that, and how important it was. They said agreed it was to talk, to articulate. And yes, I just wish people would more. It's not a sign of weakness. It's difficult, but it is very important, as you say. Well, thank you for asking me. That's very kind of you to give it another airing. Every time it's difficult, but I sort of feel a bit better afterwards, because it's a lifelong thing.
And, you know, I know you're writing a memoir, and so let us know when it's published.
Oh, if anyone will deign to.
I'm sure it will one day.
I will indeed.
Okay.
Lovely to talk to you, Cathy.
And you. All right.